If you look at modern legal systems, um, the ambition, maybe not always the reality, but the ambition is almost always the same. Equality under the law. We
Right.
sort of assume justice is universal.
Right, that's the ideal we strive for. But when we deep dive into the legal world of the ancient Mediterranean, we find a really foundational difference. Justice wasn't this universal concept at all.
How so?
It was more like a customized experience,
Yeah.
determined entirely by social status. The critical question wasn't just what was done, but who did it, and maybe even more importantly, who the victim was.
That distinction, this idea of law built on hierarchy, that's exactly what we want to unpack today.
Mm.
We're going on a deep exploration into two massive legal systems. Classical Athens, which was defined by these fragmented courts, and frankly, a lot of political feuding.
Very much so.
And then Imperial Rome, which, gave us codified law, but used it almost like a precise calculator for social status.
Exactly, a calculus of stratification. And we're pulling directly from some pretty dense source material here. We've got the forensic speeches from Athens, which really lay bare how personal litigation was.
Yeah, you can feel the anger sometimes.
You really can. And then we have the meticulous and honestly sometimes chilling legal texts of Rome, things like the Digest, which treats citizens, slaves, even the poor, with radically different legal standards. It's all spelled out.
So our mission today is to trace how status, whether you were a citizen, a slave, rich, poor, how that determined basically everything. Like the physical place your trial happened, the severity of your punishment.
All of it. And then after laying all that out, we're going to confront this very pragmatic, status-driven reality with a really radical philosophical challenge.
Wow, the Stoics.
Yes, the Stoic ideal of the sage, this idea that true freedom and true slavery, they reside only in the soul, being completely separate from any human law or social standing.
Okay, that's a fascinating contrast. So to understand the sheer complexity of ancient justice, where should we start? Athens.
Let's start in Athens, a city-state known for its, high ideals, philosophy, but its justice system. Anything but unified or objective.
Right. When you think of Athenian democracy, you often picture high rhetoric, the assembly, civic engagement. But the judicial system, it seems, was less about abstract legal rights
Much less.
and much more about just managing social conflict, personal grudges even, all through these highly politicized, segmented courts.
And the system, remarkably, despite all the political chaos Athens went through, revolutions, reforms, it was built on this bedrock of surprisingly ancient and durable law.
Yeah, the staying power of Draco's law is, well, it's one of the most surprising things when you look at the sources. This code set him way back around 621 BC.
Ancient even for them.
Exactly. It remained the cornerstone, as the sources put it, of Athenian homicide law for centuries. We're talking about a law that somehow survived democratic reforms, military defeats, even two major oligarchic revolutions in 411 and 404 BC.
Massive upheavals.
Yet, it stayed functionally intact right up until the end of the classical period. That's incredible.
It really is. And that durability, I think, it highlights just how fundamental its value was to Athenian society, which was essentially partitioning responsibility. Draco's law gave them the mechanism to divide jurisdiction based on two critical things.
Okay, what were they?
First, the nature of the act itself. Was the killing intentional or was it unintentional? And second, the unchangeable status of the people involved. Was the victim or the perpetrator a citizen or a non-citizen?
Okay, so the moment blood was spilled, the system didn't just ask, was there a killing? It immediately started sorting. Okay, intent, status.
Precisely. It began sorting the facts into these predefined segments. And because the jurisdiction, the court you went to, was tied directly to those segments, well, the court you ended up in was pretty much the single most important factor deciding your legal fate.
So where you were tried determined what could happen to you.
Absolutely. In Athens, justice was administered through this really unique judicial geography. 5 distinct homicide courts. And the destination of your trial, it truly was your destiny.
Okay, 5 courts. Let's break them down. Starting with the most serious one, I suppose, the Areopagus. It sounds quite grand, historically tied to the Hill of Ayrs.
It was grand and imposing and frankly terrifying. This court was reserved exclusively only for the intentional killing of an Athenian citizen.
Only intentional, only a citizen.
That's it. And if you were found guilty here, there were no deals, no compromises, no, mitigating circumstances considered at that stage. The penalty was mandatory death, period.
Wow.
This was the ultimate statement by the state protecting its lifeblood, its full citizens, from deliberate harm.
Okay, so that's the top tier. Now, contrast that immediately with the second court, the Palladian. This is where that status difference just hits you,
It
right?
really does, because the Palladian handled two wildly different scenarios. First, the unintentional killing of a citizen.
Okay, an accident involving a citizen.
Right. Or second, the killing of a non-citizen. And this is key, regardless of whether that killing was intentional or unintentional.
Wait, hang on. Let me get that straight. If I intentionally murder a non-citizen resident, I'm a toikos.
Yep.
I go to the Palladian, and the maximum penalty is exile.
Correct. Except.
But if I unintentionally kill a full citizen, say in a construction accident or something.
Also the Palladian, also facing exile.
So the deliberate killing of a non-citizen carries the exact same maximum penalty as the accidental killing of a citizen.
That's what the structure tells us. It screams that the law valued the status of the citizen's life, even one taken accidentally, as being legally equivalent to the life of a non-citizen taken deliberately.
It just fundamentally writes the hierarchy of bodies right into the legal code itself.
Couldn't put it better. And there's another layer at the Palladian. While conviction usually meant exile, there was a potential out.
Yeah.
If the killing of the citizen was ruled unintentional, the defendant could be pardoned by the victim's family. They had the power to forgive, legally.
Okay, so kin could intervene.
Yes, but crucially, for the intentional killing of a non-citizen, that option for pardon by kin, it didn't exist. So even within the same court, the consequences diverged based on status and intent. Status was just everything.
Okay, moving on. Court number 3, the Delphinian. This one seems to deal with very specific situations where the defendant basically says, yes, I killed him, but it was lawful.
Exactly. This is the venue for legal self-justification, essentially arguing you had the right to kill. And the criteria were incredibly precise, really specific.
What counted as lawful killing?
Well, the definition was codified. It included things like an unintentional killing during an athletic contest, like boxing or pancration, or killing a highway robber in self-defense, or unintentional friendly fire during a war, standard military stuff.
Okay, those seem somewhat understandable, maybe. Accidents in dangerous situations.
Right, but then there's the most specific category, and maybe the most culturally revealing one. The slaying of a man caught in the act, in flagrante delicto, in bed with the killer's wife, mother, sister, daughter, or even a concubine, but only one kept specifically for procreating free children, not just any concubine.
Wow. That detail about the concubine's purpose, that's incredibly specific.
It is. It shows the law drawing very sharp lines around what a male citizen was legally permitted to defend with lethal force. And that defense was centered entirely on sexual honor, the legitimacy of his household, his lineage, his children. It's basically a snapshot of Athenian patriarchy written into the homicide exemptions.
And if the jury at the Delphinian didn't buy your lawful killing claim,
then the case would essentially be judged again based on the appropriate criteria for the Areopagus or Palladian, depending on intent and the victim's status. You'd face the original potential penalties.
Right. Okay, court number 4, the Friato. This one sounds almost theatrical. It was reserved for defendants accused of homicide while already in exile. How did that even work?
It's bizarre, isn't it? Because exiles were legally forbidden from setting foot back on Attic soil. They couldn't, pollute the sacred land further with their presence.
So they couldn't appear in court.
They couldn't appear on land.
Yeah.
So the process was staged. The defendants had to plead their cases from boats, actual boats, moored just offshore. Looking at the land they were banned from touching.
Pleading your murder case from a boat, that detail, it's not just drama, is it? It underlines the sort of religious or spiritual pollution aspect of homicide in their view.
Absolutely. The crime was seen as polluting, spiritually contaminating, and the land itself, Attica, had to be physically protected from the accused. It's a very potent image.
And finally, the 5th court, the Prytanean. This one handled justice for non-humans.
Yes, the Prytanean dealt with non-human killers, animals or even inanimate objects that were deemed responsible for causing a death.
How could an object be responsible?
Well, the Athenians, interestingly, seem to have thought animals could potentially concede intent. So if an animal, say a bull, gored someone to death and was convicted, it would be executed.
Okay. And inanimate objects, like a falling statue.
Exactly. Or maybe a cart that rolled downhill and killed someone. If found guilty, the object couldn't be executed, obviously, so it was symbolically exiled. Typically by being formally carried to the border and thrown across into Boeotia.
Down over the border. That's quite something. It really shows a different worldview about agency and responsibility. #hashtag justice as a feud and political weapon.
So we've got this incredibly segmented, geographically specific system. But here's the other crucial piece. The entire process was fueled by private initiative.
Right, you mentioned no public prosecutor. That's a huge difference from today.
Huge. It meant the system relied almost entirely on the victim's family or associates deciding to bring a prosecution. And this fostered an intensely agonistic society, meaning competitive, confrontational. Litigation wasn't just about justice. It was often just another way to continue a personal conflict or feud. They even had a word for it, ecthra.
A continuation of the feud by other means.
Pretty much. And because neither the people bringing the case nor the jurors, who were just ordinary citizens, remember, no lawyers,
No legal training.
none. Because of that, the whole process was extremely vulnerable to political manipulation, strategic gamesmanship. And our sources are full of examples of how legal processes were basically weaponized for completely non-legal goals.
Like the example of Demosthenes, the famous orator. His opponents used something called the antidosis against him. Can you unpack that? It sounds complicated.
It is a bit, but think of it like this. Athenian democracy needed rich citizens to fund public services. A big one was paying for a warship, a trireme. That duty was called a triarchy, and it cost a fortune.
Okay, a massive public expense for the wealthy.
Right. Now, the antidosis was a legal challenge. If you were assigned a triarchy, but you thought someone else was actually wealthier and should be doing it instead of you could challenge them. You'd essentially say, hey, I don't think I should pay for this ship. I think you should. The other person then had a choice. Either take on the expensive duty or agree to swap all their property with yours so you could then afford it.
A property swap, that's drastic.
Very. Now, Demosthenes' opponents used this antidosis challenge against him, not because they genuinely thought he was shirking his duty, apparently, but purely to force that huge financial burden, the triarchy, onto him.
Why? What was the strategic goal?
To make it financially impossible, or at least very difficult, for him to continue pursuing a separate, ongoing civil lawsuit he had against them. It was a tactical legal strike, designed purely to drain his resources and stop his other case. Clever, but ruthless.
Using the legal system to bankrupt your opponents so they can't sue you.
That's the gist of it. And when cases like these, or homicide cases, actually got to court, the goal of the speaker, the orator, wasn't always just about presenting cold, hard facts.
What was it about then?
It was often about whipping up the jury's emotions. The orators aimed directly at stoking the jurors' sense of anger. The Greek word is orgizistai, and their desire for retribution, for revenge. The outcome could hinge more on powerful rhetoric than on, pure evidence.
There's that famous example from Lysias, right? When he was prosecuting Eratosthenes, one of the 30 tyrants who'd ruled Athens brutally.
Yeah, a powerful speech. Lysias rhetorically suggested applying strictellio, the old eye for an eye principle, basically proportional vengeance.
How did he frame it?
He argued, look, the 30 tyrants killed your sons, your relatives, jurors, so maybe the only real satisfaction, the only true justice, is to execute not just the 30 themselves, but their sons too.
Execute their sons, even though they hadn't done anything.
Exactly. Now, legally, that was impossible in Athens at the time. You couldn't execute sons for the father's crime. But as political theater, as a way to tap into the jury's grief and rage, it was incredibly effective rhetoric. It aimed to overwhelm them with emotion, demanding maximum retribution. It just confirms how Athenian justice could serve as this raw stage for political score settling.
And you also mentioned the charge of hubris being used strategically. What's that about? Hubris sounds like, excessive pride.
It needs more than just pride. It's more like outrageous behavior, violent arrogance, insult, particularly acts that intentionally dishonor someone. And the sources suggest that this charge, hubris, might have served as a kind of convenient catch-all category, as one scholar puts it.
A catch-all for what?
For prosecuting serious offenses, especially those against sexual honor, that might be difficult or embarrassing to prosecute directly.
I see. So instead of maybe bringing a charge of adultery, which could involve airing a lot of dirty laundry about your own household in public.
Exactly. Which could bring shame on the family. You might instead choose to prosecute the offender for hubris, for the outrageous insult to your honor and your household's dignity.
So the legal system recognized that violating someone's honor or dignity was, in itself, a punishable offense, and sometimes maybe a more useful one to pursue than the underlying act itself.
It looks that way. It tells us that justice, again, was heavily defined by protecting status, reputation, and honor within that very competitive social environment.
Okay, so Athenian justice. Segmented, driven by status, fueled by private feuds, swayed by rhetoric. It's a messy picture. What happens when we shift focus now? Let's move across the Mediterranean, forward in time to Rome. They're famous for law and order codification, but did they escape this status problem?
Not at all. If anything, they perfected it. Let's dive into Roman law and its own very explicit calculus of status. Right, so moving from Athens with its, somewhat chaotic, politically charged assemblies to the sprawling, much more bureaucratic system of imperial Rome. It's a big shift. We trade some of that rhetorical flourish for incredibly detailed legal codes.
More structure, maybe.
Definitely more structure, more codification. If Athens was defined by its fragmentation, Rome was really defined by stratification, hierarchy.
So Roman law took all those existing social divisions, citizen, non-citizen, rich, poor, slave, freedman, and just wrote them into the law books.
Formalized them, exactly. Created this meticulous legal calculus that determined rights, obligations, penalties, everything, with, frankly, staggering precision based on who you were. And the most foundational status division, just like in Athens, but perhaps even more economically central, was slavery. It was deeply, deeply embedded in Roman society and the economy.
Legally, the slave was property, right? Chattel.
Legally, yes. A thing, res. But, and this is where Roman law gets fascinatingly complex, our sources make it clear that the legal personhood of the slave wasn't purely external. They weren't just objects in the eyes of the law. Not entirely.
How can you be property and yet have some kind of personhood? That sounds like a contradiction.
It is a huge tension within the law. But look at this. Under specific circumstances, and legal historians like Sir Henry Maine pointed this out forcefully, a slave could actually be legally named as the heir, the universal successor to their master.
The slave could inherit everything and run the family.
Yes. Think about that paradox. The law says this person is an object you can buy and sell. Yet practically, the law also says this same object can inherit your entire estate, manage your property, and essentially govern the family unit after you die.
Why would they allow that?
It shows a profound tension between the sort of philosophical definition of a slave as property and the sheer pragmatic economic necessity. Sometimes the slave was the most capable person to manage things. The law had to bend to reality.
And this pragmatism extended to how masters were supposed to treat slaves they didn't own but maybe had the right to use, the usufructuary.
Right. If you had the right to use someone else's slave, the usufructus, the law actually bound you to observe moderation. You have to provide sufficient food and clothing. But listen to this part. It had to correspond to the slave's rank and worth.
Rank and worth for a slave.
Yes. This wasn't about compassion. It was about preserving the asset's value. The rules specifically said you couldn't just make any slave do any job. A highly educated slave, like a scribe, couldn't be forced to do degrading manual labor like carrying lime. An actor couldn't be made to work as a bath attendant.
Why? Because it would lower their value.
Exactly. The law protected the economic value of the specialized slave. Degrading a skilled slave meant degrading the owner's wealth, and the law stepped in to prevent that kind of poor management of someone else's property.
Okay, that's purely economic logic then. What about the peculium? That was property a slave could manage.
Yes. The peculium was basically funds or property that a master allowed a slave to manage, technically still owned by the master, but operated by the slave. And the sources show a slave could use the peculium to acquire not just property, but also obligations, debts, all in the owner's name.
So they were acting as a kind of economic agent for the master.
A sophisticated one, sometimes.
Yeah.
And it gets even more complex. Yeah. If a slave was jointly owned by two masters, right, and that slave acquired property through the peculium that only one master had provided, the obligation or benefit acquired was legally considered acquired for both masters.
Even the one who didn't provide the initial funds.
Yes. It shows this complex, shared legal interest. The law treated the peculium almost like an extension of the master's own economic identities, proving the slave wasn't just a passive tool, but could be a legal agent in certain financial contexts. It's complicated stuff.
Definitely. Now, moving up the ladder a bit, what about ex-slaves? The libertini or freedmen? They weren't property anymore, but were they fully free?
Not quite. They occupied this unique sort of transitional status. They were no longer property, but they weren't usually considered the same as freeborn citizens either. There were lingering ties.
Like what?
Well, very often they still owed specific service duties, called opere, to their former masters, their patrons. It was a kind of lingering obligation that really maintained the social power and status of the former master.
So freedom wasn't always a clean break.
Not always. However, imperial policy did sometimes try to, let's say, soften these edges or incentivize certain behaviors. We see Emperor Augustus, for instance, bringing in social legislation that offered freedmen a legal way out of these specific operae.
How?
If the freedman had 2 children with a free spouse, not another freed person, but someone born free, then they could be relieved of those service obligations.
So it was a pragmatic incentive. Get married to a free person, have kids, contribute to the free Roman population, and we'll cut some of those ties to your old master.
Exactly. A social engineering policy, really.
Yeah.
But then there's another way status could be overridden: sheer proximity to power.
How so?
In the early empire, particularly, some ex-slaves of the emperor himself could rise to incredibly significant positions of administrative power. We're talking about heading major government bureaus, controlling vast resources.
Former slaves running parts of the government.
Yes, and astonishingly, some receive the actual insignia of high rank, the symbols, the clothing, the honors, usually reserved only for the traditional Roman nobility, the senators, and equestrians.
Wow. So imperial favor could just completely trump the normal legal hierarchy.
In certain cases, absolutely. Being the emperor's freedman was a unique and potentially very powerful position. But for most people, that rigid stratification was inescapable. And nowhere was it more brutally obvious than in Roman criminal law. It explicitly codified different punishments based purely on your social class.
So not just your citizenship status, but your wealth.
Wealth and social standing, yes. Roman law consciously created and named 2 distinct classes for legal treatment in criminal matters.
What were they called?
They were the honestiores, literally the more honorable ones.
Mm-hmm.
This meant the wealthy, the upper classes, senators, equestrians, local elites. And then there were the humiliores, the more lowly ones, basically everyone else, the poor, the common folk, most provincials.
And the law treated them differently how?
Starkly differently, especially in punishments. The law openly stated that the honestiores were to be spared certain particularly harsh or degrading penalties, things like crucifixion, being sentenced to forced labor in the mines, or being thrown to wild beasts in the arena.
Those were reserved for the lower classes.
Almost exclusively for the humiliores. The sources are quite clear on this. And this wasn't just, judges being biased. It was written into the legal commentaries and likely reflected in sentencing guidelines.
Did they try to justify this?
Oh, yes. Roman lawyers openly talked about it in terms of essentially class control. They explicitly recognized and wrote down that for the humiliores, the fear of punishment, the Latin is poenimitas, was a very real thing. They basically admitted the system relied on terrorizing the lower classes to maintain public order.
Using extreme punishment as a deterrent specifically aimed at the poor.
Precisely. Now, the sources show that philosophical attitudes towards capital punishment varied a bit among the elite themselves. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher we'll talk more about, he seemed to accept the death penalty quite readily in his writings.
So not necessarily squeamish about it.
Not particularly. But out in the provinces, away from Rome, the response to crime seems often driven by very practical concerns, like economic protection, using extreme deterrence.
Any examples?
The really powerful one comes from the Emperor Hadrian. We have a rescript, that's an official reply to a query, he sent to the provincial council of Baetica in Spain. They asked about cattle thieves.
Okay, rustling, a common rural crime.
Yes, and Hadrian's response.
Yeah.
He mandated they be most severely punished. And he explicitly notes in the rescript that such criminals were usually condemned to death.
Death penalty for stealing cattle.
Apparently so, or at least it was common enough for the emperor to mention it. It shows the state prioritizing the protection of valuable property, livestock in this case, with the most extreme deterrence possible, aimed squarely at the lower classes who are likely driven to such crimes by economic hardship.
And you can't really talk about law in the provinces without talking about the officials running things, can you? The governors.
No, you really can't.
Yeah.
We have to be blunt here. For many high-status Romans, getting a provincial governorship wasn't just about administering justice or representing Rome. It was seen as an opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
To enhance their own status, gain military glory perhaps, and quite frankly, to make a profit. These governorships were often filled by amateurs from the elite, not professional administrators. And enrichment was often part of the expectation.
So corruption was built in.
It seems to have been incredibly widespread. So much so that the very first permanent judicial tribunal set up in Rome way back in 149 BC was created specifically to handle complaints from provincials about illegal extortion, repetundae, by Roman governors.
Okay, so they recognized the problem and set up a court to deal with it. Did it work?
Well, therein lies the tragic irony. Instead of actually stamping out corruption, the sources suggest that this court's function often just devolved. It ended up merely establishing, and here I'm quoting loosely from scholarly summaries, a convention as to the level of extortion which would be condoned.
So it didn't stop the extortion, it just set the acceptable rate of extortion.
That seems to be the grim reality in many cases. The law, even when designed to curb abuse by the powerful, often ended up just standardizing the level of exploitation that the imperial system would tolerate. Power and profit remain deeply intertwined with law.
Okay, so we've painted a picture of ancient legal systems, both in Athens and Rome, that are fundamentally built around status, property, power. Hierarchy is just baked in.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned earlier that during the Roman imperial period, this whole very stratified legal reality encountered a really profound philosophical challenge, something that questioned the entire basis of human law as they knew it.
Exactly. And this challenge came primarily from Stoicism. It wasn't just an abstract philosophy. It provided a potent moral compass, especially for thinkers who were also deeply involved in the practical world of law and governance. People like Seneca, who advised Nero, or Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself.
So Stoicism held up a kind of mirror to the laws of Rome.
A very critical mirror. It judged the flawed, pragmatic laws of the human city against what the Stoics believed was the perfect, rational law of nature, the logos that govern the cosmos. And central to this was their idea of the ideal human. The sage, ###A, the radical Stoic view of true freedom.
Right, the Stoic sage. You said this idea presented a single radical claim that basically undercut the whole legal system based on status.
It really did. Because for the Stoics, the ultimate goal in life wasn't wealth or status or political power. It was living a life of perfect virtue, in complete accordance with reason and nature.
And the sage was the one who achieved this.
The sage was the ideal, perhaps purely theoretical human being who had achieved this state. Perfectly rational, completely free from disturbing passions like anger, fear, excessive desire. The sage lived in perfect harmony with the divine reason governing the universe. And crucially for the Stoics, only the sage was truly free.
Only the sage. What about everyone else? Roman citizens, emperors.
According to strict Stoic doctrine, they were all fools,
Yeah.
adulty, and because they weren't perfectly rational, they were slaves.
Slaves. Even the emperor.
Yes. Here's the paradigm shift. The Stoics argued that anyone who was at the mercy of their desires and passions, meaning basically everyone who wasn't a perfect sage, was eo ipso, by that very fact, in a state of slavery, moral slavery. They were enslaved by their own ignorance, their irrational beliefs, their uncontrolled emotions.
So there's legal slavery, being someone's property.
Right, the kind Roman law dealt with.
And then there's this moral slavery, being ruled by your passions.
Exactly. And for the Stoics, this moral slavery was the only kind that mattered. The legal kind, the kind that merely affected your body, your external circumstances. They judged that to be an external indifferent. Meaning it had no real bearing on your true state, your soul's condition. It was of no significance to your actual virtue or happiness.
Yeah.
Whether you were legally a slave or legally an emperor, if you weren't a sage, you were morally a slave. If you were a sage, you were morally free, even if legally enslaved.
Wow. That completely turns Roman social and legal structures upside down.
Completely. This philosophical ideal stood in the starkest possible contrast to the entire framework of Roman law, which, as we saw, meticulously defined your status based on birth, wealth, citizenship, legal rights. The Stoic sage couldn't care less about the Roman census or legal status. They cared only about the virtue and rationality of the soul.
And you mentioned this had implications for how they viewed crime, too. Something about all crimes being equal.
Yes, that's another radical consequence of their perfectionist ethics. For the Stoics, virtue was an all-or-nothing state. You're either perfectly virtuous a sage or you weren't. There were no degrees of virtue.
Okay.
Therefore, any action that was not born of perfect virtue and perfect rationality was by definition an error, a vice, a sin, in the philosophical sense. And since all errors deviate from the single standard of perfection,
They're all equally wrong.
in a fundamental sense, yes. From a perspective of perfect virtue, deviating by, say, stealing a loaf of bread because you irrationally desired it, or committing murder out of irrational anger, both are failures to act virtuously. Both demonstrate the rule of passion over reason. In that specific philosophical sense, because any deviation from perfection is total deviation, all errors, all crimes are equal.
That's hard to grasp from a practical legal standpoint. How could court possibly operate on that basis, saying theft is the same as murder?
It couldn't, and the Stoics knew that. This was a philosophical judgment, not a proposal for legal reform. It contrasts so sharply with the very practical, very messy business of the Roman courts, which had to make distinctions. They had to categorize crimes, assess damages, determine intent, and decide exactly how much someone should be fined or exiled or, how brutally they should be executed based on who they were. Hashtag B, legal pragmatism, intent, and imperial authority. And that clash, that tension between the Stoic ideal of perfect inner virtue and the practical needs of the legal system, it's really well illustrated by how Roman law handled the concept of intent.
Intent seems crucial in most legal systems. Did you mean to do it?
Exactly. While Stoicism was looking inward, at the overall moral state of the soul, Roman law was focused very pragmatically on the specific, demonstrable intention behind a specific action when determining legal liability.
Like with injuria, outrages or insults.
Precisely. Roman law defined injuria, which covered things from physical assault to verbal insults, as acts that had to be intentionally committed against a person with the aim of diminishing their honor or dignity. The intent was key.
And the source gives specific examples.
Very specific hypotheticals, which lawyers clearly debated. For instance, the Digest discusses this. If a person strikes a free man, but they mistakenly thought that free man was their own slave.
Okay, a case of mistaken identity.
Right. In that case, the person who threw the punch would not be legally liable for injuria, for outrage against a free person.
Why not? They still hit a free person.
Because the necessary intent, the specific intention to commit an outrage against a free person, was absent. Their intent was directed at striking someone they believed was their slave, which under Roman law was generally permissible as discipline or property management. They lacked the specific malicious intent, dolus malus, required for the crime of injuria against a free man.
So the mental state, the specific target of the intent, was paramount.
Absolutely. And here's an even finer distinction they made. If you were, say, aiming to strike your actual slave, and you accidentally hit a free man who happened to be standing nearby.
An errant blow.
Exactly. You were also not liable for injuria against the free man. Why? Because your intent was directed at the slave. The harm to the free man was unintentional collateral damage. Again, the lack of directed conscious intent aimed at that specific free victim meant the act wasn't legally classified as outrage.
That detailed focus on the specifics of intent, it really highlights the practical, almost technical nature of Roman legal thinking, doesn't it? It's very earthbound compared to the Stoic focus on the soul.
Very much so. It's prioritizing specific legal facts, provable intent, over any kind of broader moral judgment about whether the person was angry or acting out of passion in general. But this legal pragmatism, this constant effort to apply the rules but also achieve some measure of fairness, it wasn't just left to individual judges or lawyers. It was often moderated from the very top.
By the emperor.
By the emperor, yes. The emperors, usually advised by their councils of expert jurists, actively manage this ongoing tension between sticking to the strict letter of the established law, ante strictum, and applying principles of fairness or equity, aequitas.
How did they manage that across a vast empire?
It required a colossal administrative effort, mainly through things like imperial edicts and, importantly, rescripts. Those were replies to magistrates out in the provinces who wrote in, asking for guidance on tricky cases.
So the emperor was acting like a Supreme Court almost.
In many ways, yes. His word was law. We even see this reflected in an interesting comment by Emperor Constantine. He apparently expressed surprise that one of his prefects felt the need to consult him about the legal validity of judgments made by Christian bishops in their own courts, which Constantine had granted some authority.
What does his surprise tell us?
It underscores the assumption of absolute, centralized authority. Constantine felt his previous decrees should have been clear enough. The prefect shouldn't have needed to ask again. The emperor's ruling was final.
But did these rescripts always just enforce the strict law, or did they allow for flexibility?
They definitely allowed for flexibility.
Yeah.
That was crucial for the system to function without becoming completely rigid and unjust. An imperial rescript might explicitly acknowledge that, while, and I'm paraphrasing the legalistic language, none of the established legal forms should be readily altered. Nevertheless,
There's a but.
there's a but. Some relief should be given when equity clearly demands it. This shows the empire constantly trying to balance the need for predictable, stable law with a necessary degree of fairness, of justice in the individual case. It was a perpetual tightrope walk, really defining the complexities of Roman governance and law.
So even with this incredibly organized, codified system centrally managed by the emperor, the actual administration of that law, especially far from Rome, still seems deeply tied up with power, status, and even profit.
Absolutely. As we saw with the provincial governors, the system was incredibly organized on paper, but its implementation was inextricably linked to maintaining the power structure, protecting property, especially of the elites, and yes, often facilitating the extraction of wealth. The high ideals of law constantly rubbed up against the hard realities of empire.
It seems the story of ancient law, then, isn't really about a pure system of abstract rules. It's more about how power structures get encoded, formalized, and enforced through detailed, segmented, and highly technical regulations.
That captures it very well. Law as a tool, reflecting and reinforcing the society that created it. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, we've journeyed through quite a legal landscape today, from Athenian feuds to Roman codes, and the takeaways, I think, really do challenge some of our modern assumptions about what justice is or should be.
Definitely. We started by mapping those 5 distinct status-dependent justice routes in classical Athens, showing how everything, from the intentional killing of a citizen landing you in the Areopagus facing death,
Right.
to the accidental death of a non-citizen being handled in the Palladium with exile as the outcome. It was all rigidly segmented by who you were. And the whole system was driven as much by private grudges and political maneuvering as by legal principle.
And then we shifted to Rome and saw how Roman law, while more codified, meticulously enshrined hierarchy. We looked at the paradox of the slave legally property, yet capable of being an heir, managing a peculium, having protected worth.
And the stark difference in criminal punishment based entirely on wealth and social standing. The honestior is spared the worst, while the fear of extreme punishment, poene mitis, was explicitly used to control the humiliores.
And finally, we brought in that radical philosophical counterpoint from the Stoics, contrasting the legal reality, where status defined everything, with their claim that true freedom and true slavery exist only in the soul of the sage, completely independent of external laws or conditions.
Yeah, that idea that moral slavery, being ruled by passion and ignorance, was the only kind that truly mattered. It's a profound challenge to any system based purely on external status.
So this deep dive, it really reveals that legal systems, ancient or modern, they're fundamentally human creations, aren't they? Constantly trying to negotiate between maybe high moral ideals, whether that's Stoic virtue or Roman equity, and the much more pragmatic, sometimes self-serving realities of power, wealth, and social divisions.
Exactly. Law isn't handed down from on high, perfect and pure. It's forged in the messy reality of human society.
So what does this analysis mean for you listening today? Well, maybe it challenges us to look beyond just the stated ideals of any legal code, our own included, to ask who the law benefits, who it implicitly or explicitly targets, to recognize that law is always, in part, a mirror reflecting the social and economic layers of the society that creates and uses it.
That's a crucial takeaway, and it leads us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. If the Stoics were even partially right, if the only true slave is the person enslaved internally by their own ignorance, their own uncontrolled desires and passions, what does that really say about the nature of freedom, about citizenship?
Does true liberty begin somewhere else entirely? Not in the courtroom, not in the statute books, but maybe in the quiet, rational control of your own soul, regardless of the external laws of whatever state you happen to live in.
A question that maybe proves the most profound legal judgments aren't always rendered by a court or a jury, but perhaps by philosophy itself.
A fascinating place to leave it. That was the deep dive.